The lawyer's voice was steady, clinical even, as he read my father's will aloud in that suffocating conference room. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was watching her. My wife. The woman I'd loved with every broken piece of me for 3 years. Her face had gone pale, then red, then something else entirely. Panic. Raw, unfiltered panic. And that's when I knew. She hadn't married me because she loved the way I laughed at her terrible jokes. She hadn't married me because I stayed up with her through her nightmares or because I memorized how she liked her coffee. She married me because she thought I was the key to my father's empire. $57 million. Properties across 4 states. A legacy built over decades. And she'd played the long game, hadn't she? The sweet smiles. The whispered promises. The way she'd hold my hand in public like I was her entire world. But the will had a clause. A single, devastating clause my father had buried in the fine print like a landmine. Everything would be mine, and mine alone, on one condition. I had to divorce her first. Within 30 days. No negotiation. No loopholes. The room went silent. She looked at me, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't see my wife. I saw a stranger wearing her face. I met her on a Tuesday in October, the kind of day where the air smells like coffee and dying leaves. The kind of day that feels suspended between seasons, caught in that delicate moment when summer finally admits defeat and autumn claims its territory with gentle cruelty. The sky was that particular shade of gray that makes everything look softer, more forgiving, like the world itself had been wrapped in cashmere. She was sitting alone in a bookstore café, reading something by Murakami, her hair falling over her face like a curtain drawn against the world. I noticed her the moment I walked in, though I tried to pretend I hadn't. There was something about the way she held herself, curled into that oversized armchair like she was trying to disappear into it, that made me want to know her story. The afternoon light came through the window at just the right angle, turning everything golden and soft, and she was haloed in it like something out of a painting I couldn't afford. Her fingers traced the edges of the pages as she read, slow and reverent, like the book was something sacred she'd been trusted to protect. I didn't believe in love at first sight. I thought it was something people made up to sell movies and diamonds, a convenient fiction for those too lazy to build something real brick by brick. I'd spent 28 years watching people fall in and out of love like it was a revolving door, relationships spinning and cycling and ending with predictable regularity, and I'd promised myself I'd never be that stupid, that reckless, that vulnerable to another human being. But when she looked up and smiled at me, something in my chest cracked open. Not broke. Cracked. Like an egg. Like something that had been waiting its whole life to split apart and let the light in. Her smile was small and uncertain, like she wasn't sure if I was really looking at her or through her at something else, and that uncertainty made it more beautiful somehow. Her name was Elena. She told me this after I'd been standing there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, frozen like an idiot with 2 coffees in my hands because the barista had called my name twice and I'd grabbed both drinks without thinking, my brain short-circuited by the sight of her. I should have just walked away. Should have given 1 coffee to a stranger on the street. Should have done literally anything except walk over to her table and say the stupidest words that have ever come out of my mouth. I think this might be yours. It wasn't. We both knew it wasn't. But she smiled anyway and said thank you and gestured to the empty chair across from her like she'd been waiting for me all along. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, lived in a studio apartment with plants she couldn't keep alive, and had this laugh that sounded like wind chimes on a summer porch. The kind of laugh that made you want to be funnier, better, more interesting just so you could hear it again and store the sound of it away for lonely days. She didn't know who my father was. Didn't know about the fortune or the family name that opened doors I never asked to walk through, that came with expectations heavier than chains and responsibilities I'd inherited along with my eye color. Didn't recognize the weight I carried around like stones in my pockets, pulling me down into depths I'd learned to navigate but never learned to escape. To her, I was just Daniel. The guy who accidentally ordered her coffee and was too embarrassed to admit it wasn't his. The guy with ink stains on his fingers from a pen that had exploded in his pocket that morning and a hole in his sweater he'd been meaning to fix for 3 months and absolutely no idea what to say to a woman who looked at him like he might actually be worth knowing. We talked for 4 hours that day. About books and bad movies and the way the city looked at night when you were lonely, when the lights turned everything into a painting and you could almost forget you were just another person wandering through someone else's masterpiece. She told me she loved Murakami because his characters were always a little bit lost, a little bit searching, and she felt seen in their confusion. She told me she'd moved here to escape something. Her voice went quiet when she said it, her eyes drifting to somewhere I couldn't follow, somewhere in her past that still had teeth sharp enough to bite. I saw the shadow pass over her face like a cloud across the sun, darkening everything for just a moment before she pulled herself back to the present. She didn't say what she was running from. I didn't push. I understood running away better than most people. I'd been doing it my whole life, just staying in the same place while I did it, running in circles inside a cage made of expectations and family legacy and money that felt more like a curse than a blessing. She ordered 3 more coffees even though she barely touched them, just so we'd have an excuse to keep sitting there as the afternoon bled into evening. I watched her hands as she spoke, the way they moved through the air like she was painting pictures only she could see. She had a scar on her left wrist, thin and white like an old memory, and I wondered about it but didn't ask. Some stories need permission before they're told, need trust before they're shared. When the cafe started closing, the barista giving us pointed looks as she stacked chairs on tables around us like we were obstacles in her way, I realized the sun had gone down and the street outside had filled with evening and we'd somehow talked away an entire afternoon like it was nothing, like time was something we could afford to waste. I offered to walk her home. She hesitated for just a second, weighing the risk of trusting a stranger against whatever instinct had kept her talking to me for 4 hours, then nodded and pulled on a coat that had seen better days, frayed at the cuffs but worn with the kind of affection that comes from loving something long past its expiration date. We walked slowly through streets that had turned blue with twilight, past shops closing for the night and restaurants just opening for dinner, past people hurrying home to lives and loves and obligations we knew nothing about. She pointed out details I'd never noticed, architectural flourishes on buildings I'd walked past 1,000 times, shadows that looked like art if you tilted your head just right. When we reached her building, a walk up in a neighborhood that was trying hard to be trendy but hadn't quite made it yet, she turned to me with something like hope in her eyes. Something vulnerable and scared and brave all at once. She kissed me on the cheek and said, "See you around, Daniel." Her lips were soft against my skin, gone too quickly, leaving behind the ghost of warmth and the faint scent of vanilla and something I couldn't name but wanted to drown in. I knew right then I'd do anything to make sure she did. See me around, I mean. I'd rearrange my entire life, rewrite every plan I'd made, burn down every bridge if it meant being in the same room as that laugh, that smile, that moment when she looked at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. I walked home through streets that suddenly seemed brighter, more alive, like someone had turned up the saturation on reality itself. Every color sharper. Every sound clearer. The whole world rearranged around the fact of her existence. I didn't know her last name. Didn't have her number. Only knew where she lived because I'd walked her there and watched her climb the stairs to a 3rd-floor apartment with paint-chipped walls and a window box full of dead flowers she'd probably killed with kindness. But I knew I'd find her again. I knew it the way you know the sun will rise, the way you know water is wet, the way you know some things are inevitable even when you can't explain why. I didn't know then that she'd already decided to find me. That she'd known exactly who I was the moment I walked into that cafe. That my face had been memorized from society pages and business magazines, studied like a map to buried treasure, analyzed for weaknesses and opportunities. I didn't know that I was already caught. Already falling. Already lost in a trap that had been set with precision and baited with everything I'd ever wanted. I just knew that for the first time in my life, I wanted to be found. The next 6 months felt like a dream I was afraid to wake up from. The kind of dream where everything is too perfect, too bright, too good to be real, and you spend the whole time waiting for the moment when it all dissolves into morning light and disappointment and the grey reality of your actual life. Elena became my everything. Not slowly, not gradually the way they tell you love is supposed to happen, but all at once, like a flood breaking through a dam I didn't know I'd built. She filled every empty space in my life I'd convinced myself I didn't have, showed me all the ways I'd been living half awake, half alive, half here, going through motions I'd mistaken for living. She'd show up at my apartment with takeout and bad wine, and we'd sit on the floor talking until the sun came up. She hated chairs, said they were too formal, too much like trying, too much like the performance of being people instead of just being. So we'd lean against the couch with cartons of pad thai growing cold between us, and she'd tell me about the clients who wanted their logos to look like every other logo they'd ever seen, wanted safe instead of interesting, and I'd tell her about the pressure of a name I never asked for, a legacy that felt like wearing someone else's skin. She loved old jazz records and terrible reality TV. The combination made no sense until I watched her dance to Miles Davis in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, her body moving like water, like smoke, like something not quite solid, then collapse on the couch an hour later to watch people scream at each other about nothing on shows with names like Drama and Heartbreak and Betrayal. She said it was about balance. High art and low entertainment. Beauty and chaos. She said life needed both or it got boring, got stale, got too heavy to carry. She'd paint my hands with watercolors and call them her masterpiece. I'd sit there for hours, perfectly still, watching her concentrate with the tip of her tongue caught between her teeth as she turned my palm into gardens and galaxies and abstract expressions of emotions that didn't have names yet. She said hands told stories, that mine told a story of someone who'd never had to work for anything but was tired anyway, tired in a way that had nothing to do with labor and everything to do with weight. I introduced her to my father once, briefly, at a charity gala I couldn't avoid. One of those mandatory appearances where my absence would be noted and commented on and used as evidence of my ingratitude, my failure to appreciate the empire he'd built and the doors it opened. She wore a dress she'd found at a thrift store, vintage emerald green that made her look like old Hollywood, like Grace Kelly if Grace Kelly had lived in a studio apartment and couldn't keep plants alive and painted other people's hands at 2 in the morning. She'd been nervous, her hands shaking as she applied lipstick in my bathroom mirror, asking if she looked okay, if she'd fit in, if his world would chew her up and spit her out. I told her she looked perfect. Told her she'd be fine. Told her my father was just a man, not a monster, even though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. He shook her hand with a grip that lasted exactly 3 seconds, smiled politely with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and made small talk about the weather and the venue and nothing that mattered. Later, in the car on the way home, he told me she seemed nice but forgettable. The words landed like stones in my stomach, heavy and cold and wrong. My father never forgot anyone. He studied people like chess pieces, always 3 moves ahead, always calculating value and threat and use. He remembered names and faces and conversations from decades ago, could recall details about business associates' children and wives and hobbies with perfect clarity. But I was too in love to notice. Too drunk on the taste of her mouth and the sound of my name in her voice and the way she fit against me like she'd been custom made for the empty spaces in my ribs, for the gaps between my bones, for the hollow place in my chest I'd been carrying around since my mother died when I was 7. Elena never asked about money. Never pressed me about my family or what I did for a living beyond the vague consulting work I pretended occupied my days, the meetings I didn't have and the projects that didn't exist. She said she loved me for me. Said it while we were washing dishes side by side with soap bubbles up to our elbows. Said it while we were walking through the park feeding ducks stale bread. Said it while we were tangled in sheets that smelled like her shampoo and my cologne and the particular chemistry of us. And I believed her. God, I believed her so completely, so totally, so stupidly. I believed her the way you believe in gravity, in sunlight, in the ground beneath your feet. I never thought to question it. Never thought to doubt. Never thought to look for the cracks in the foundation because the house felt so solid, so safe, so much like home. When I proposed, it wasn't grand or public. I'd seen enough performative proposals, enough restaurant applause and flash mob videos and elaborate schemes designed more for social media than for the actual couple, and I knew that wasn't us. That wasn't what we were. Just us, in that same bookstore café where we met, rain hammering against the windows like the sky was trying to break through, trying to flood the world and wash everything clean. We'd made it a tradition to come back every month, to sit in the same corner, to remember how we started. I gave her my mother's ring. A simple sapphire my father had kept locked away for years in a safe I wasn't supposed to know about, the only piece of her he'd held onto after she died, after he'd donated her clothes and sold her car and erased every trace of her from the house like she'd never existed. I'd had to ask him for it, endure his cold stare and the long silence that stretched between us like an ocean before he finally unlocked the safe and placed it in my palm without a word, without explanation, without blessing. She cried when she saw it. Tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking as she held it up to the light and watched the sapphire catch fire, watched it glow like it had a heart. She said yes before I even finished asking, the words tumbling out of her mouth like she'd been holding them in, waiting, hoping. She threw her arms around my neck so hard we nearly fell out of our chairs, and the other cafe patrons applauded even though I'd specifically chosen a corner table to avoid exactly that kind of attention. We got married 3 months later in a small ceremony. Just us, a judge, and 2 strangers we pulled off the street as witnesses because we didn't want to make it a thing, didn't want my father's opinions or society's expectations or anyone else's version of what our love should look like. She wore a white sundress she'd found on sale at a store that was going out of business. I wore the only suit I owned that wasn't tailored by people who charged more per hour than most people made in a week, that didn't have my father's money sewn into every seam. And when she said I do, her voice clear and strong and certain, I thought I'd never be alone again. I thought I'd found the one true thing in a world built on lies and appearances and carefully constructed facades. I thought I knew what love was. What it looked like. What it cost. I had no idea I'd already paid more than I could afford. Had no idea the bill was still coming. Had no idea that everything I thought was real was just another performance, another lie, another trap closing around me while I smiled and said I do. When I proposed, it wasn't grand or public. I'd seen enough performative proposals, enough restaurant applause and flash mob videos and elaborate schemes designed more for social media than for the actual couple, and I knew that wasn't us. That wasn't what we were. Just us, in that same bookstore cafe where we met, rain hammering against the windows like the sky was trying to break through, trying to flood the world and wash everything clean. We'd made it a tradition to come back every month, to sit in the same corner, to remember how we started. I gave her my mother's ring. A simple sapphire my father had kept locked away for years in a safe I wasn't supposed to know about, the only piece of her he'd held onto after she died, after he'd donated her clothes and sold her car and erased every trace of her from the house like she'd never existed. I'd had to ask him for it, endure his cold stare and the long silence that stretched between us like an ocean before he finally unlocked the safe and placed it in my palm without a word, without explanation, without blessing. She cried when she saw it. Tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking as she held it up to the light and watched the sapphire catch fire, watched it glow like it had a heart. She said yes before I even finished asking, the words tumbling out of her mouth like she'd been holding them in, waiting, hoping. She threw her arms around my neck so hard we nearly fell out of our chairs, and the other cafe patrons applauded even though I'd specifically chosen a corner table to avoid exactly that kind of attention. We got married 3 months later in a small ceremony. Just us, a judge, and 2 strangers we pulled off the street as witnesses because we didn't want to make it a thing, didn't want my father's opinions or society's expectations or anyone else's version of what our love should look like. She wore a white sundress she'd found on sale at a store that was going out of business. I wore the only suit I owned that wasn't tailored by people who charged more per hour than most people made in a week, that didn't have my father's money sewn into every seam. And when she said I do, her voice clear and strong and certain, I thought I'd never be alone again. I thought I'd found the one true thing in a world built on lies and appearances and carefully constructed facades. I thought I knew what love was. What it looked like. What it cost. I had no idea I'd already paid more than I could afford. Had no idea the bill was still coming. Had no idea that everything I thought was real was just another performance, another lie, another trap closing around me while I smiled and said I do. It started small. Little things I told myself didn't matter, little shifts in the foundation I convinced myself were just settling, just adjustment, just the normal wear of time on any relationship. Every marriage has bumps, I told myself. Every couple goes through phases. This is normal. This is fine. This is nothing. Elena began asking about my father more. How he built his business from nothing to empire. What his plans were for retirement, for succession, for the future. If he'd ever talked about his estate, about what would happen to all that money, all those properties, all those investments when he was gone. The questions came casual, dropped into conversations like afterthoughts, like idle curiosity over morning coffee or pillow talk in the dark when our guards were down and words flowed easier. Nothing aggressive. Nothing demanding. Just wondering, she'd say. Just curious. Just trying to understand your world. I laughed it off. Told her my father would outlive us all, would probably outlive the cockroaches and the concept of death itself. He was only 62, healthy, stubborn as a brick wall and twice as unbreakable. The kind of man who seemed immune to the entropy that took everyone else, like he'd made some deal with death to come back later when it was more convenient, when he'd finished building his empire and didn't have anything left to prove. But she kept asking casual questions over breakfast while she scrambled eggs and I read the paper. Hypotheticals during late-night conversations when the world felt small and safe and far away from the harsh light of day. What would happen if something happened to him? Who would take over? What the structure looked like? Whether he'd made plans. Whether he'd told me anything about his wishes, his intentions, his final arrangements. I thought she was just curious. Maybe even concerned. Maybe trying to understand the weight I carried, the inheritance that felt more like a curse than a blessing, the empire that would someday crush me under its expectations. I told myself she was trying to know me better, to understand the complicated relationship I had with the man who'd raised me with ice in his veins and expectations in his eyes and love that looked like criticism, like pressure, like constant disappointment barely held in check. Then my father got sick. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The words came from his doctor like bullets, precise and devastating and final. "There's nothing we can do," the doctor said in a voice he'd probably practiced in medical school, the voice for delivering death sentences. "We can make him comfortable. We can manage the pain. But we can't stop this." The doctors gave him 6 months. He lasted 4. For months of watching the strongest man I'd ever known waste away to nothing, become a shadow in a hospital bed, become small in a way I'd never imagined possible. For months of watching him disappear piece by piece, his body giving up even as his mind stayed sharp as a knife, sharp as broken glass, cutting everyone who got too close. And during those 4 months, Elena transformed. She was suddenly the perfect daughter-in-law, the role she'd never tried to play before becoming her full-time occupation, her mission, her calling. Visiting him in the hospital every other day, sometimes more. Bringing him books he'd never read and his favorite cigars he wasn't allowed to smoke but liked to smell anyway, liked to hold like talismans against the death closing in. She'd sit by his bed for hours and talk to him about art and history and philosophy and things I didn't know she cared about, things she'd never mentioned in all our hours of conversation. She'd discuss Renaissance painters and World War II and economic theory with the kind of knowledge that seemed to come from nowhere, like she'd been studying, preparing, rehearsing for this exact role. I thought she was being supportive. I thought she was showing me how much she loved me by loving the man who raised me, by sitting vigil at the bedside of someone she barely knew because he mattered to me. I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was proof that I'd chosen right, married right, found someone who understood that love meant showing up even when it was hard, even when it smelled like antiseptic and death. She'd hold my hand in the hallway while I tried not to cry, stroke my hair while I pressed my face into her shoulder and felt like a child again, small and scared and lost. She whispered that it would be okay, that we'd get through this, that I wasn't alone, that she'd be there every step of the way. And I clung to her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had gone liquid and strange, like she was the lighthouse and I was drowning and her light was the only thing keeping me from slipping under the waves. My father never said much during her visits. Just watched her with those sharp, calculating eyes. The eyes that built empires and buried enemies and saw through every lie anyone had ever tried to tell him. Even as the cancer ate him from the inside, even as the morphine made everything soft and distant, those eyes stayed sharp. Stayed focused. Stayed aware. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at her with an expression I couldn't read. Something between contempt and pity and grim satisfaction, like he was watching a play he'd seen before and already knew how it ended. 3 days before he died, he called his lawyer. Mr. Harrison, who'd handled his affairs for 30 years, who knew where all the bodies were buried both literally and figuratively. His voice was barely a whisper by then, his body so thin the hospital gown hung on him like a shroud, but his mind was still that steel trap, still working angles I couldn't see, still playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. Changed his will, the nurse told me later. She wasn't supposed to tell me. Probably violated 6 different privacy laws. But she'd seen too many families torn apart by deathbed decisions and she felt sorry for me, this man-child who clearly had no idea what was coming. I didn't know the details then. I was too busy holding Elena's hand in the hospital hallway while she cried, her tears soaking through my shirt in hot wet patches. Her body shook against mine and I thought she was mourning, thought she was grieving for the father-in-law she'd barely known but tried so hard to connect with, tried so hard to love for my sake. I never thought to wonder what she was really crying about. Never thought to question why her grief seemed so desperate, so visceral, so much bigger than made sense for someone she'd only really known for 4 months. Never thought to look closer at the woman I'd married and see what my father had seen from the very beginning. The predator wearing the skin of my perfect girl. The hunter dressed up as the dove. The lie painted so beautifully I mistook it for truth and called it love and let it destroy me. The funeral was small, exactly as he'd wanted. My father didn't want fanfare or speeches, didn't want tears from people who'd feared him more than loved him, didn't want the spectacle that money usually bought and social standing usually demanded. No eulogies. No reception. No gathering of vultures dressed in black pretending grief they didn't feel. Just a quiet burial and a few close friends. Men in dark suits who shook my hand with grips that felt like tests, measuring my strength, weighing my worth, wondering if I'd fill the shoes left empty. Women in black who'd known my mother once upon a time and looked at me like they were seeing her ghost, like I was some kind of resurrection, some kind of do-over for a life cut too short. The sky was gray and low, threatening rain that never came, and I stood there feeling nothing, feeling everything, feeling like I was watching it happen to someone else. Like I was floating 3 feet above my body looking down at this scene, this tableau of grief and duty and the performance of being a good son to a father who'd never been warm, never been soft, never been anything but expectation wrapped in flesh. Elena stood beside me the entire time, her hand in mine, her fingers laced through my fingers with exactly the right amount of pressure. Not too tight. Not too loose. Perfect. Her face was a mask of perfect grief, tears tracking down her cheeks at precisely timed intervals, her lower lip trembling just enough to look genuine but not enough to look theatrical. She wore black that fit too well for something bought in a hurry, pearls that had appeared from nowhere, and she dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that looked like it had been purchased specifically for this purpose, still had the creases from the package. Everything about her was perfect. Too perfect. But I didn't see it then. I leaned on her. I needed her. I'd never needed anyone more in my life, standing there watching them lower the only family I had left into the ground, feeling like I was being buried with him, feeling like part of me was in that coffin going down into the dark cold earth. A week later, the lawyer called. Mr. Harrison, his voice neutral and professional even as he delivered words that would detonate my life like a bomb planted years ago and finally given permission to explode. Said we needed to meet. Standard procedure, he explained, his tone suggesting this was routine, normal, nothing to worry about. Reading of the will. Just formalities. Just paperwork. Just the business of death and inheritance and the transfer of power from one generation to the next. Elena insisted on coming with me. Said she wanted to support me, didn't want me to face it alone, said I'd been through enough and she wasn't going to let me walk into that room without someone who loved me by my side. I didn't think twice. Why would I? She was my wife. My partner. The person who'd held me together through the worst 4 months of my life, who'd sat with me in hospital hallways and held my hand through vigils and cried with me when the end finally came. We sat in that conference room with its leather chairs and mahogany table and walls lined with law books no one ever read, books that existed purely to look impressive, to remind you that this was serious business conducted by serious people. Her leg pressed against mine under the table, her fingers laced through my fingers on top of it, and I felt anchored by her touch, grateful for the warmth of her beside me in that cold room with its cold fluorescent lights and cold professional sympathy. The lawyer opened the folder with the kind of ceremony that suggested he knew what was coming, knew what bomb he was about to drop, and was trying to prepare us without actually preparing us because that would violate some code of lawyer conduct. He began to read. His voice steady and careful, each word measured out like medicine, like poison disguised as cure. Properties. Investments. Accounts. The apartment building on 5th. The house in the Hamptons. The commercial properties downtown. The stock portfolio. The bonds. The offshore accounts. Numbers so large they stopped sounding real, stopped meaning anything beyond the abstract concept of wealth, of power, of the empire my father had built brick by brick, deal by deal, betrayal by betrayal. And all of it, every single dollar, every single asset, every single piece of the puzzle, was left to me. My father's empire, built over 40 years of ruthless deals and calculated risks and destroyed competitors, laid at my feet like a crown I'd never wanted, a throne I'd spent my whole life running from. I felt Elena's grip tighten. Just slightly. Just enough that I noticed but didn't understand. I squeezed back, thinking she was happy for me, proud of me, excited about the security this meant for our future. But then came the clause. The one my father had added 3 days before his death, his hands shaking as he signed the codicil but his mind clear as glass, sharp as a knife, cutting through bullshit and lies and performance to see the truth underneath. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. His eyes flicked to Elena, then to me, then back to the paper like he was reading words he wished didn't exist. In order to inherit, he read slowly, carefully, making sure every word landed, you must be legally divorced within 30 days of his passing. If you remain married at the end of that period, the entire estate will be liquidated and donated to the following charitable organizations. He listed them. Foundations I'd never heard of. Causes my father had never mentioned. Places his money would go instead of to me if I didn't do exactly what he demanded. The room went silent. The lawyer's voice stopped and the air seemed to thicken, seemed to solidify around us like amber, trapping us in this moment forever, this moment when my entire understanding of reality shattered like glass. I felt Elena's hand go rigid in mine. Not tense. Rigid. Like every muscle had locked, like rigor mortis had set in while she was still alive. Like she'd turned to stone beside me, like Medusa had walked into the room and caught her mid-breath. Her breathing stopped for 3 full seconds. I counted them because I didn't know what else to do, because my brain had stopped processing and all I could do was count. 1, 2, 3. I turned to look at her. Her face was white. Not pale. White. Drained of color like someone had pulled a plug and let all the blood run out, let all the life leak away. Her eyes were wide, pupils blown like she'd been hit, like she'd taken a physical blow to the head. Her mouth was open in a perfect O of shock, and I could see her tongue, could see the silver filling in her back molar, could see everything because she'd forgotten to close her mouth, forgotten to perform, forgotten to pretend. And in that moment, I understood. Really understood. Not with my mind, which was still scrambling to catch up, still trying to make the pieces fit, but with something deeper. Something older. The part of me that lived in my gut and my bones and knew the truth before my brain could process it, before my heart could accept it, before my conscious mind could form the words. She hadn't gasped in shock. She'd gasped in horror. Not horror at my father's cruelty or the impossible choice he'd forced on me or the vindictive nature of punishing me from beyond the grave. Horror at being caught. Horror at the trap closing. Horror at losing the game she'd been playing since the moment we met. Because she'd lost. She knew it. And I knew it. And in that frozen moment in that sterile room with the lawyer watching us both with professional detachment, the entire architecture of my life collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane, like a sandcastle at high tide, like everything I'd built on lies finally, inevitably, catastrophically falling apart. Because my wife hadn't married me for love. She'd married me for a fortune she'd never see. And my father, the man I'd thought was cold and cruel and incapable of love, had saved me the only way he knew how. By taking everything away. By forcing my hand. By making me choose between love and truth, between her and survival, between the fantasy I'd been living and the brutal reality he'd seen from the beginning. By loving me the only way he knew how. I didn't say anything in that room. Just stood up, my legs moving on autopilot while my brain tried to catch up to the betrayal unfolding in my chest like a flower blooming in reverse, petals falling away to reveal thorns underneath. I signed the papers I needed to sign, acknowledging receipt of information, confirming my identity, initiating the 30-day countdown. My hand was steady even though everything inside me was shaking apart, fragmenting into pieces I didn't know how to put back together. Then I walked out. Didn't look at Elena. Didn't look at the lawyer. Didn't look at anything except the door, my singular focus on getting out of that room before I broke down, before I screamed, before I did something I couldn't take back. Elena followed me, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown, like the ticking of a bomb about to explode, like seconds falling away toward some inevitable detonation. The sound echoed in the hallway, too loud, too sharp, each click another nail in the coffin of whatever we'd had, whatever we'd pretended to have, whatever lie we'd been living. She grabbed my arm in the parking lot, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. I could feel her nails through my jacket, through my shirt, cutting into skin like she could hold on to me through sheer force, like she could keep me from walking away if she just gripped hard enough. "Daniel," she said. Her voice was shaking but I couldn't tell if it was fear or anger or desperation or some combination of all three. This is insane. Your father was cruel. This is vindictive and horrible, and we can fight this. We can contest it. There has to be a way. We'll get another lawyer. We'll find a loophole. We'll prove he wasn't in his right mind. I pulled away from her. The movement felt like tearing flesh, like ripping off a bandage that had grown into the wound, become part of the tissue, become impossible to remove without damage. For the first time in 3 years, I looked at my wife and saw a stranger. Worse than a stranger. An enemy wearing a loved one's face. A predator in prey's clothing. How long? I asked. My voice came out flat, dead, like all the emotion had been burned out of it, like I'd used up my lifetime supply of feeling in the last 10 minutes and had nothing left. How long were you planning this? She blinked. Her face went through 3 different expressions in 2 seconds, cycling through confusion and hurt and fear like she was trying them on to see which one fit, which one would work, which mask would save her. What? Daniel, what are you talking about? You're not making sense. How long were you planning this? I repeated each word carefully, precisely, like I was afraid if I said them too fast they'd fall apart, lose their meaning, dissolve into nothing. When did you decide to marry me for his money? When did you choose me? Was it the first time you saw me, or did you research me first? Did you study me? Did you practice? She tried to laugh. Tried to play it off like I was crazy, like grief had broken my brain, like I was the one who wasn't making sense. The sound came out wrong, too high, too brittle, like glass breaking, like the fake thing it was. I don't know what you're talking about. Daniel, you're in shock. You're grieving. You're not thinking clearly. This isn't you. This isn't us. But her eyes betrayed her. Darted away. Looked anywhere but at me. At the cars in the parking lot. At the sky. At her hands twisting together. At the ground. Everywhere except the person she'd promised to love forever, promised to honor, promised to cherish until death did us part. I thought about every moment. Every question she'd asked about my father's money, and I'd brushed off as innocent curiosity, as the normal interest of someone trying to understand their partner's life. Every time she'd steered conversations toward estate planning, and I'd thought she was being responsible, being mature, being the kind of partner who thought about the future. I thought about the transformation when he got sick, the perfect daughter-in-law act that had seemed so loving, so genuine, so selfless. The hospital visits. The cigars. The long conversations about art and history with a man she barely knew. All of it calculated. All of it strategy. All of it performance. I thought about the way she'd cried when he died, tears streaming down her face like her heart was breaking. The way she'd held my hand at the funeral, supported me, anchored me. The way she'd insisted on coming to the reading, said she wanted to be there for me. And I realized none of it was real. None of it had ever been real. Not the bookstore café. Not the 4 hours of conversation. Not the painting on my hands. Not the I love yous whispered in the dark. All of it lies. All of it performance. All of it carefully constructed to get exactly what she'd gotten, exactly what she'd almost gotten, exactly what my father had taken away with his final act. You married me for his money, I said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a fact, solid and heavy and undeniable as gravity, as death, as the 30-day countdown now ticking away toward either freedom or poverty. She didn't deny it. Just stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air, like she was searching for the right lie and coming up empty. Her hands twisted together, ringing and ringing, and I watched her the way you'd watch a car crash, horrified but unable to look away, needing to see how bad the damage was, needing to witness the full scope of destruction. Daniel, please, she finally whispered. You don't understand. It's not that simple. I can explain. It's not what you think. Yes, okay, at first I knew who you were, but it changed. I fell in love with you. You have to believe me. But it was exactly what I thought. And we both knew it. The truth sat between us like a living thing, ugly and undeniable and impossible to kill, and there was no way to put it back in the box, no way to unsee what I'd seen, no way to unknow what I now knew. How much of it was real? I asked. Any of it? The bookstore? The coffee? Did you follow me there? Did you know I'd be there? Was every single moment a lie? She was crying now. Real tears or fake, I couldn't tell anymore. Maybe she couldn't tell either. Maybe she'd been pretending so long she didn't know where the performance ended and the person began. I turned and walked away. Put one foot in front of the other even though my legs felt like water, even though every step took more effort than it should have, like I was walking through concrete that hadn't quite set, like the world itself was trying to hold me back, keep me there, make me stay. She called after me. Screamed my name. Daniel. 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 Her voice cracking on the third repetition, breaking into something raw and desperate that might have been real emotion or might have been just another performance, and I'd never know, would spend the rest of my life wondering and never being sure. But I didn't look back. Couldn't look back. Because if I looked back I might forgive her. Might convince myself there was an explanation, a reason, a way to make sense of the senseless. Might talk myself into believing the lies again because they were so much more comfortable than the truth, so much easier than accepting I'd been played, used, manipulated from the very first moment. And my father hadn't saved me from a loveless marriage just so I could walk back into it with my eyes open, just so I could choose the lie over truth, fantasy over reality, comfortable deception over painful honesty. He'd given me a choice. 30 days to choose between love and truth, between her and survival, between everything I thought I wanted and everything I actually needed. And I'd already made it. I filed for divorce the next morning. Walked into my lawyer's office at 8 a.m. sharp, before I could change my mind, before I could talk myself into believing there was another way, before I could convince myself that love was worth more than truth and that maybe, possibly, we could build something real on a foundation of lies. My lawyer said it would take at least 3 weeks to finalize, possibly 4 depending on how backed up the courts were. We had time. Barely. The 30-day deadline hung over everything like a sword suspended by thread, counting down with mechanical precision toward either inheritance or poverty, freedom or charity, survival or principle. Helena didn't fight it. That surprised me more than anything. I'd expected lawyers. Expected battles. Expected her to contest and delay and drag it out past the 30-day deadline so that even if she didn't get the money, at least I wouldn't either. Expected scorched earth, mutual destruction, the kind of bitter end that happens when love turns to hate and nothing matters except hurting each other as much as possible. But she didn't. The papers came back signed within 48 hours, her signature neat and final at the bottom of each page, agreeing to everything, contesting nothing, asking for nothing. No alimony. No property division. No claims on anything. Just her signature and white space and the end of everything we'd pretended to be. She just disappeared. Moved out of our apartment while I was at work, like a ghost evaporating in daylight. I came home to empty spaces where her things had been, negative space outlining the shape of a life that had turned out to be fiction. Hangers in the closet with nothing on them. Gaps on the bookshelf. The bathroom counter missing her regimen of products I'd never understood the purpose of. She took her clothes, her books, the plants she'd never learned to keep alive and hadn't managed to kill yet through some miracle of neglect and occasional overcompensation. Every trace of her except the memories I couldn't pack in boxes and throw away, couldn't delete, couldn't erase no matter how much I wanted to. The apartment felt bigger without her, emptier, like a mouth with missing teeth, like something had been amputated and I was still feeling phantom pain from the missing limb. She left the ring on the kitchen counter. My mother's ring. The sapphire catching the light like a silent accusation, winking at me every time I walked past, reminding me of everything I'd believed and everything that had turned out to be lies. I couldn't touch it for days. Couldn't bring myself to pick it up and put it back in the box where it belonged, back in the safe where my father had kept it for 21 years waiting for the right woman who turned out to be the wrong woman who turned out to not even be a woman but a performance, a role, a carefully constructed fiction. I thought I'd feel relief. Victory, even. Triumph over the woman who'd tried to use me, who'd built our entire relationship on lies and calculations and cold arithmetic. I thought I'd feel vindicated. Thought I'd feel smart for figuring it out, for seeing through her, for choosing truth over comfortable deception. But all I felt was empty. Hollowed out. Like she'd taken something with her that I couldn't name, couldn't quantify, couldn't get back. Like she'd scooped out my insides and left just the shell, just the outline of a person who used to believe in things like love and honesty and the possibility of being known. I spent those 30 days in a haze. Going through the motions. Signing papers. Meeting with accountants and lawyers and financial advisors and people who wanted to help me manage the fortune I was about to inherit, who appeared like vultures the moment they smelled money changing hands, circling and waiting and offering services I didn't understand for fees that seemed astronomical but were apparently standard. But I couldn't stop thinking about her. About the woman I thought I knew. The woman who'd painted my hands and laughed at my terrible jokes and cried during sad movies and promised to love me forever. The woman who'd held me while my father died and kissed me goodbye every morning and fit against me like she'd been made for exactly that purpose. Had any of it been real? The late-night conversations that stretched until dawn? The dancing to Miles Davis at 2 in the morning? The way she'd looked at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered? Or was I just a mark from the beginning? A target she'd identified and researched and played perfectly, every moment calculated, every smile measured, every touch strategic? I went back to the bookstore café where we'd met. Sat in the same corner table. Ordered the same coffee I'd accidentally stolen from her that first day, though it tasted like ash now, like everything good had been burned out of it. The barista was different, didn't recognize me, didn't know she was serving someone having an existential crisis over a cup of overpriced espresso. I watched people come and go and wondered how many of them were lying. How many relationships in this room were built on truth and how many were just elaborate performances, people playing roles they'd been assigned or chosen or fallen into without meaning to. How many of these couples holding hands over coffee would make it? How many were already over but didn't know it yet? On day 28, the divorce was finalized. The lawyer called me with congratulations in his voice, like I'd accomplished something worth celebrating, like I'd won some kind of prize. Like I hadn't just legally ended the relationship I'd thought would last forever, hadn't just signed papers that said what we'd had wasn't real enough to keep, wasn't true enough to save. I was officially alone. Officially rich. And officially heartbroken. 3 things that felt like they should cancel each other out but somehow made everything worse, somehow combined into something heavier than the sum of their parts. The inheritance transferred the next morning, 2 days before the deadline, 2 days of buffer between me and losing everything. My phone buzzed with notifications from banks I didn't know I had accounts with, alerts about deposits so large they looked like typos, like someone had put the decimal point in the wrong place. My father's empire was mine now. Every property, every investment, every carefully built piece of his legacy. The apartment building on 5th. The house in the Hamptons nobody ever used. The commercial properties downtown. The stock portfolio diversified across 17 different sectors. The offshore accounts in places I'd never been and couldn't find on a map. All of it mine. All of it waiting. All of it worth exactly what I'd paid for it. Everything. It came 2 days after the divorce was final. A letter, handwritten, slipped under my apartment door while I was sleeping or staring at walls or trying to remember how to be a person who wasn't defined entirely by betrayal and grief and the empty space where trust used to be. I almost threw it away. My hand was halfway to the trash, the envelope already crumpling in my fist when I saw my name on the front, written in her handwriting, those familiar loops and curves that I'd watched form shopping lists and birthday cards and I love you notes left on the bathroom mirror in lipstick that would smudge when I tried to kiss it. But something made me open it. Curiosity or masochism or the pathetic hope that maybe there was an explanation that would make it hurt less, that would make sense of the senseless, that would give me something to hold on to besides rage and grief and the feeling that I'd wasted 3 years loving someone who'd never existed. Daniel, it began. Her voice was clear in my head as I read, like she was speaking the words instead of writing them, like she was sitting across from me in that conference room all over again. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to read this. You probably threw it away and I don't blame you. But I needed to write it anyway. I needed you to know the truth. The real truth. Not the version you've built in your head or the version your father showed you or the version that's easiest to believe. Just the truth. I did marry you for the money. At first. I won't lie about that anymore. I'm done lying. I'm done pretending. I'm done with all of it. I was drowning in debt. Medical bills from my mother's cancer that took her slowly, painfully, expensively over the course of 3 years. I watched her waste away while the bills piled up higher and higher until I couldn't see over them anymore, couldn't breathe under their weight. Student loans I'd never be able to pay, not in this lifetime, not with the freelance work I could barely find in a market saturated with designers willing to work for exposure and experience and promises that never materialized into actual money. I'd been barely surviving for 3 years, robbing Peter to pay Paul, watching the number in my account go down and down and down with no end in sight, no relief, no way out. I was one emergency away from homelessness. One missed payment away from losing everything. I was desperate and stupid, and when I found out who your father was, I saw a way out. Not a plan, exactly. Not at first. Just a possibility. Just a door that might open if I knocked hard enough, if I smiled right, if I played the part well enough. Just a chance at breathing again, at sleeping without panic attacks, at existing without the constant weight of owing, always owing. I researched you. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I found out where you went, what you liked, what bookstore you visited every Tuesday like clockwork. I wore the right clothes. Read the right books. Became the right person. The person I thought you'd fall for. The person who'd seem perfect for someone like you. But somewhere along the way, it changed. You changed everything. I fell in love with you, Daniel. Really, truly, in the most inconvenient and painful way possible. I fell in love with the way you thought about books like they were friends instead of objects. The way you made terrible puns and laughed at them yourself when I didn't. The way you couldn't dance but tried anyway, your body moving with so much enthusiasm and so little rhythm that I couldn't help but love you for it. I fell in love with your kindness and your doubt and the way you looked at me like I was something precious instead of something broken, something disposable, something only valuable for what it could provide. I fell in love with the way you saw me, even though the me you were seeing was a performance, was a lie, was someone I'd constructed specifically to trap you. And I hated myself for it. Because I knew what I'd done. I knew I'd started this as a lie, and no matter how real it became for me, no matter how much I actually fell, the foundation was rotten. You can't build a house on sand. You can't build a marriage on deception. It doesn't matter how much you want it to work. It doesn't matter how real it feels. The beginning poisons everything that comes after. Your father knew. He saw right through me from the beginning, from that first handshake at the gala when I was so nervous I thought I'd throw up. That night when he smiled at me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and told you later I was forgettable. I felt him reading me like a book, seeing through every lie, every performance, every carefully constructed moment. That's why he wrote that clause. Not to punish you. To free you. He knew I'd never tell you the truth on my own. Knew I was too selfish, too cowardly, too desperate to let you go. Knew I'd keep taking and taking and taking until there was nothing left of you but the shell I'd hollowed out. So he forced my hand. Made it impossible for me to keep lying. Made me show you who I really was. And he was right. I wouldn't have told you. I would have kept lying forever, kept pretending, kept being the person you thought I was, even though that person never existed, was never real, was just a role I played so well I almost started believing it myself. I don't expect you to believe me about falling in love with you. I don't expect anything. I know how this looks. I know how it sounds. Woman gets caught, woman claims she really loved him all along, woman expects sympathy she doesn't deserve and hasn't earned. I just needed you to know that for one brief, beautiful moment, I was the person you thought I was. The woman who loved you without agenda. Without calculation. Without thinking about what I could gain or what it would cost or how to play the next move. Just loved you. Simply. Completely. Stupidly. And I'll spend the rest of my life wishing I'd been her from the start. Wishing I'd met you when I wasn't desperate, when I wasn't drowning, when I could have loved you cleanly without the poison of lies underneath it all. I'm sorry. I know it doesn't mean anything. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know sorry is just a word people say when they've done terrible things and want to feel better about themselves. But I'm sorry anyway. Elena. I read it 3 times. Sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and read it over and over, felt the words settle into me like stones, heavy and cold and permanent. I looked for the lie in them, the manipulation, the angle. Tried to figure out what she gained from this confession, this final performance, this last attempt to make me see her as human instead of monster. But I couldn't find it. Just pain. Just regret. Just the echo of something that might have been real buried under all the lies, struggling to breathe, dying anyway. I didn't know if I believed her. Didn't know if it mattered. The foundation was still rotten. The beginning was still a lie. And you can't save something that was broken from the start, poisoned at the root, built on sand that was always going to shift. Then I burned it. Took it to the kitchen sink and held a lighter to the corner and watched the flame eat her words, turn her confession to ash and smoke and nothing. Watched it curl and blacken and disappear like our marriage, like my trust, like every beautiful thing that turned out to be a trick of the light, a mirage, a lie I wanted so badly to be true that I ignored every warning sign. I told myself it didn't matter whether she'd loved me or not. The foundation was still rotten. The beginning was still calculated. And you can't build truth on top of lies no matter how much you want to, no matter how real the feelings become later, no matter how desperately you wish you could go back and start over clean. But I kept the ashes. Swept them carefully into an envelope with hands that shook just slightly. Put them in the safe where my father used to keep my mother's ring, next to that ring that I'd finally put back in its box, that sapphire that had witnessed a proposal built on lies and a marriage that never stood a chance. Some lies you can't quite let go of, even after you burn them down. Some truths hurt too much to hold but hurt too much to release. Some things exist in the space between keeping and discarding, between believing and doubting, between love and betrayal. And sometimes that's where they have to stay. 5 years later, I stood in the same bookstore café where we met. I don't know what brought me back. Nostalgia or punishment or the anniversary of something I couldn't quite name but felt in my chest like an old wound that never fully healed, just scabbed over and ached when the weather changed. It was raining again. October rain, the kind that smells like coffee and dying leaves and the past. The same smell that had been in the air the day my life changed, the day I stopped believing in perfect girls and love at first sight and happy endings that didn't come with footnotes and conditions and fine print that revealed the truth too late. The cafe looked exactly the same. Same mismatched furniture. Same art on the walls from local artists who'd never be famous. Same barista apron hanging by the register, though the face wearing it was different, younger, someone who hadn't been here 5 years ago and didn't know the ghosts that haunted this corner. The same corner table where she used to sit was occupied by a young couple, barely 20, holding hands across napkins and empty cups. They looked at each other like they'd invented love, like they were the first people to ever feel this way, like their story would be different from everyone else's. They looked the way I probably looked sitting here with Elena 5 years ago, blind and hopeful and so convinced of their own specialness they couldn't see the cliff ahead. I felt ancient watching them. Felt like a ghost haunting his own life, seeing himself in their faces and wanting to warn them, wanting to tell them it doesn't work out. It never works out the way you think, everyone is lying about something and love isn't enough to overcome the lies. But I didn't. Let them have their moment. Let them believe. Maybe they'd be different. Maybe they'd be the exception. Maybe I was just bitter and they were right to believe in love and happy endings and trust. I'd built something with my father's fortune. Something he never would have built, something that would have disgusted him probably, seemed weak to him, seemed like throwing good money after sentimentality. But something I needed to make sense of it all, to make his death mean something, to make the 30 days and the divorce and the pain serve some purpose beyond just inheritance. A foundation in his name. The Clayton Foundation. It had a nice ring to it, looked good on letterhead, made his legacy something other than ruthless business practices and destroyed competitors and a son he'd saved by forcing the most painful choice imaginable. Scholarships for kids who couldn't afford college. Medical grants for families drowning in hospital debt, families like Elena's had been, families one illness away from bankruptcy and ruin. Exactly the kind of help Elena said she'd needed, the kind of lifeline that might have saved her from desperate choices and calculated lies and marrying someone she had to learn to love instead of loving first. I never saw her again after that letter. Heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved out west. Started over. Portland or Seattle or somewhere it rained even more than here, somewhere green and grey and far away from the wreckage we'd made together. Someone said she was still doing graphic design. Someone else said she'd gone back to school. I didn't ask for details. Didn't want to know. Didn't want to care. I didn't look for her. Didn't try to reach out. Told myself I was being strong, being smart, protecting myself from reopening wounds that had barely healed, that were still pink and tender and vulnerable to infection. Told myself it was the right choice. The only choice. But sometimes I wondered. Late at night when sleep wouldn't come and the apartment felt too big and too empty. If I'd forgiven her. If I'd believed the letter. If I'd chosen love over pride, over hurt, over my father's final lesson in seeing people clearly and protecting yourself from those who'd hurt you. Would it have worked? Could you build something real on a foundation of lies if you both wanted it badly enough, if you both committed to truth moving forward, if love was strong enough to overcome its poisoned beginning? I'll never know. Some stories don't get the ending you want. They just end. They stop mid-sentence and leave you wondering what the next word would have been, what the next chapter might have said, whether the story could have been saved if only you'd made different choices or been different people or met at different times when you were both whole instead of broken. But I learned something in those 30 days between my father's death and the divorce. Something it took 5 years to fully understand, to accept, to make peace with, even though peace felt like the wrong word for this uneasy truce with the past. Love isn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It's about truth. The kind of truth that's ugly and hard and sometimes destroys the very thing you're trying to save. It's about choosing honesty over comfort, reality over fantasy, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted, everything you thought you needed, everything you built your life around. And my father, in his own cold, calculating way, had given me the greatest gift. He'd shown me who she really was before I wasted a lifetime pretending. He'd loved me the only way he knew how. With strategy. With protection. With a final move that saved me from myself, from my own willful blindness, from the comfortable lies I would have kept believing because believing was easier than seeing. I finished my coffee. The young couple was still there, still lost in each other, and I didn't have the heart to tell them what I'd learned. That love is beautiful and terrible, and the two things aren't mutually exclusive, aren't opposites, are maybe the same thing viewed from different angles. That sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones who love you best, who see what you need instead of what you want, who give you truth instead of comfort. That truth is more valuable than happiness, and sometimes you have to choose between them and live with the consequences. I walked out into the rain. Let it soak through my jacket, plaster my hair to my head, wash over me like baptism or drowning or something in between, something that cleanses and kills at the same time. The streets were slick with it, reflecting lights and turning everything into watercolor, blurring the edges of reality. And for the first time in 5 years, I felt free. Not happy. Not whole. But free. Free from the weight of wondering. Free from the prison of what might have been. Free from the ghost of a woman who never existed outside the performance she gave, the role she played, the lie she told so well we both almost believed it. Not because I'd inherited a fortune. Money can't buy freedom. It can only buy the illusion of it, the comfortable cage, the gilded chains that feel like choices but are just different kinds of prison. The foundation helped. Giving the money away to people who needed it, watching it do good instead of just sitting in accounts accumulating more of itself like a disease. But that wasn't what freed me. It was letting go of the lie. The beautiful, terrible, perfect lie that had almost destroyed me. It was choosing truth over love, reality over romance, survival over the fantasy of who she might have been if circumstances were different, if she'd met me when she wasn't desperate, if I'd been anyone other than my father's son. And sometimes, that's the only inheritance that matters. Not the money or the properties or the empire built on ruthless deals and destroyed competitors. But the wisdom bought with heartbreak. The strength forged in betrayal. The knowledge that you can survive losing everything and still be standing when the rain stops, still breathing, still capable of walking into bookstore cafes and walking back out again without falling apart. I walked home through streets that didn't seem any brighter than before, past people who didn't know my story and wouldn't care if they did, carrying a fortune I'd never wanted and a lesson I'd paid too much to learn. The rain kept falling. I kept walking. The world kept turning the way it always does, indifferent to individual heartbreak, to lessons learned too late, to love that turned out to be something else entirely. But I was still here. Still breathing. Still capable of feeling something besides rage and grief and betrayal. Still capable of watching young couples in bookstore cafes and feeling something that wasn't quite hope but wasn't quite despair either. Something in between. Something real. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could ask for. To survive the lies. To learn the lessons. To keep walking even when you didn't know where you were going, just knew you couldn't stay where you were. Maybe that was what my father had been trying to teach me all along. Not that love was a lie. But that truth was worth more than love. That seeing clearly was worth the pain of disillusionment. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is force them to face reality, even when reality hurts, even when it costs them everything they thought they wanted. I got home and hung my wet jacket on the hook by the door. Made tea I wouldn't drink. Stood at the window and watched the rain and thought about Elena somewhere out west starting over, carrying her own lessons, her own regrets, her own version of this story where maybe she was the victim and I was the villain and my father was the cruel architect of unnecessary pain. Maybe she told herself she really had loved me. Maybe it was true. Maybe both things could be true at once. That she'd calculated and manipulated and lied, and also that she'd fallen in love somewhere in the middle of the performance, caught in her own trap, destroyed by her own success. I'd never know. That was okay. Some questions don't have answers. Some stories don't have resolution. Some people walk out of your life and take the truth with them and you have to make peace with not knowing, with uncertainty, with the space between what you want to believe and what you can prove. I was learning. 5 years later and still learning. How to be alone without being lonely. How to be rich without being empty. How to remember without reliving. How to carry the past without being crushed by its weight. I was learning. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything.